You were not chosen one day, you were born this way. Before the titles, before the awakenings, before the language you now use to describe yourself, there was something about you that stood out quietly. Not in a loud, attention-seeking way, not in a way that demanded recognition, but in a way that felt undeniable, even if no one could quite explain it. From childhood, you felt different. Not necessarily better, not necessarily more talented, just different. While other children seemed fully immersed in the moment, you were observing it. While others reacted impulsively, you reflected. You sensed when something felt off in a room long before anyone spoke. You felt emotional shifts that were invisible to others. You carried questions that seemed too deep for your age. You sensed things others didn't. You could feel tension before it surfaced. You understood unspoken dynamics. You picked up on inconsistencies. Even when you didn't have the vocabulary to articulate what you were perceiving, your intuition was already active. Adults may have called you sensitive. Peers may have called you quiet or intense. But beneath those labels was awareness. Awareness that most people don't develop until much later in life, if at all. And you carried depth at an early age. You thought about meaning, about fairness, about identity, about why certain things happened. You processed experiences internally in ways that made you feel older than you were. Sometimes that depth created distance between you and others. It made small talk feel exhausting. It made surface-level conversations feel incomplete. You may have wondered if something was wrong with you because you couldn't fully relate. But nothing was wrong. Those traits were not flaws, they were signatures. They were markers of design, not defects in personality. The sensitivity was perception. The introspection was awareness. The sense of not fully belonging was not evidence that you were misplaced. It was evidence that you were built differently. When you are designed to see beyond the surface, you will naturally feel separate from those who remain on it. For a long time, you may have tried to tone it down, to blend in, to appear less intense, to hide the depth so that others would feel more comfortable around you. But even when you attempted to conform, something inside you refused to disappear completely. That internal clarity remained. That awareness never fully dimmed. Because it wasn't learned, it was inherent. You didn't become the chosen one. You entered the world as one. Not in a dramatic, cinematic sense, not as someone crowned at birth, but as someone wired with perception, resilience, and inner authority from the beginning. The challenges you faced did not create those qualities. They revealed them. The isolation did not invent your awareness. It highlighted it. The hardships did not install strength. They exposed the strength that was already there. You were not ordinary trying to become significant. You were significant, learning how to understand yourself. And if you look back honestly, the evidence has always been there. In the way you processed life, in the way you endured early responsibility, in the way you carried yourself even when you doubted your path. The difference was never accidental. It was intentional design. If this already feels like it's describing your life, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who's always felt different, and subscribe, because what you're about to understand may change how you see your entire story. The signs were there since childhood. Long before you had language for it, the signs were already there. You matured emotionally early. Not because you were trying to, not because someone formally taught you to, but because life seemed to require it. While others were carefree, you were perceptive. While other children moved through moments lightly, you absorbed them deeply. You noticed tone changes. You registered silence. You could sense when something was wrong, even if no one explained it. You did not simply experience life, you interpreted it. There were times when adults spoke around you, assuming you were too young to understand. But you understood more than they realized. You read facial expressions. You caught the pause before a difficult truth. You sensed the shift in energy when conflict lingered in the air. Even if you did not fully comprehend the details, you felt the weight of situations that others dismissed as normal. That emotional maturity did not feel like a gift at the time. It may have felt isolating. You may have wished you could be lighter, less aware, less affected. But awareness is rarely accidental. It develops where it is needed. It forms where perception is required. You sensed tension others ignored. In a classroom, in your home, in social settings. There were moments when the atmosphere changed and you felt it instantly. Your body reacted before your mind processed. You knew when someone was pretending. You knew when something was unsaid. You knew when harmony was forced rather than genuine. Sometimes you spoke about what you sensed and were told you were imagining things. Other times you stayed quiet, because you learned that not everyone wants their reality exposed. Either way, your perception remained intact. It did not disappear simply because it was inconvenient. You may have questioned yourself because of that sensitivity. You may have wondered if you were overthinking or exaggerating. But over time, patterns proved your intuition correct. Situations unfolded exactly as you had anticipated. Conflicts surfaced that you had sensed weeks earlier. Truths emerged that you already felt internally. Sensitivity is not weakness. It is perception operating without filters. You felt separate even in groups, not necessarily rejected, not always excluded, but separate, as if there was an invisible layer between you and everyone else. You could participate, you could laugh, you could blend in temporarily, but internally, you often felt like an observer rather than a participant. Group dynamics fascinated you more than they consumed you. You noticed hierarchies forming. You sensed alliances shifting. You detected insecurity hidden beneath confidence. While others were immersed in the surface of interaction, you were aware of the structure beneath it. That awareness creates distance, not because you are disconnected, but because you are conscious. And consciousness changes how you experience belonging. You may have longed for deeper connection while simultaneously feeling unable to fully relate to surface-level exchanges. That tension can feel confusing when you are young. It can make you question whether you are too different, too intense, too aware. But early awareness is not coincidence. It is design. Some people develop perception later in life through hardship. Others are born with a heightened sense of awareness that shapes their entire journey. If you look honestly at your childhood, the signs were present long before you understood their significance. The depth, the sensitivity, the intuition. They were not installed by circumstance, they were activated by it. Sensitivity is perception, not weakness. The world often mislabels depth. It calls it overthinking. It calls it fragility. It calls it being too much. But depth is the ability to see layers where others see surfaces. It is the ability to feel nuance where others feel simplicity. It is the capacity to detect shifts that remain invisible to most. Weakness collapses under pressure. Perception strengthens with it. And you did not collapse. Even when your sensitivity felt overwhelming, you adapted. You learned when to speak and when to remain silent. You learned how to process internally. You developed discernment. You grew stronger without losing awareness. That is not weakness. That is refinement. Feeling out of place often signals higher awareness. When you perceive more, you naturally question more. When you question more, you align less easily with environments that lack depth. This does not make you superior, it makes you conscious. And consciousness can be uncomfortable in spaces that prefer autopilot. You may have felt like you were ahead of your environment in some ways and behind in others. Ahead in perception, behind in fitting in. That imbalance creates tension. But tension is not always negative. Sometimes it is evidence that your internal frequency does not match your external setting. The discomfort you felt was not proof that you were misplaced in life. It was proof that you were aware of more than your surroundings could offer. Children who carry awareness early often grow into adults who carry responsibility naturally. Because when you are accustomed to perceiving nuance, you are prepared to navigate complexity. When you are used to sensing emotional undercurrents, you are equipped to lead with discernment. The signs were there, in the way you responded to injustice, in the way you protected others instinctively, in the way you processed disappointment without completely losing hope, in the way you sought meaning instead of distraction. You were not merely existing, you were observing, learning, integrating. And even when you doubted yourself later in life, those early traits never fully left. Your intuition remained active, your depth remained intact, your awareness remained sharp. It may have been overshadowed by insecurity at times, but it was never erased. You were different because you were designed to see differently, not to stand above others, but to perceive what others overlook. Not to isolate yourself intentionally, but to navigate life with clarity. Not to carry superiority, but to carry awareness. The signs were not random quirks of personality, they were signatures of design. They were indicators that your path would require perception, that your journey would demand discernment, that your calling would rely on awareness cultivated from the beginning. And once you recognize that those early traits were intentional, your entire story begins to shift. The early hardships were not random. If the awareness was present from childhood, the hardship was not far behind. Challenges appeared sooner than expected. While others seemed to move through early life with relative ease, you encountered weight early. Situations that required maturity before you felt ready. Conversations that forced you to process realities beyond your years. Decisions that carried consequences you did not fully understand at the time. It may have felt unfair. You may have wondered why certain lessons came to you earlier than others. Why you had to grow up faster. Why stability sometimes felt fragile. Why responsibility seemed to arrive before freedom. When you compare timelines, it can look like you were handed more than your age should have carried. But timing is rarely accidental. Responsibility came early. You may have been the one who kept things together emotionally, the one who noticed when something was wrong and adjusted quietly, the one who held space for others even when you needed support yourself. You may have taken on roles that shaped your character long before you consciously chose them. Early responsibility can feel heavy. It can create a sense of seriousness that separates you from peers. It can make you feel older internally than your environment reflects. But responsibility builds structure, it forces discipline, it accelerates awareness. And structure is essential for anyone designed to carry influence later. Isolation shaped independence. There were moments when you stood alone, not necessarily because you chose to, but because circumstances required it. Situations where you could not rely on others the way you wished you could. Times when you had to make sense of confusion without guidance. Moments when you felt misunderstood and chose silence over confrontation. Isolation can wound, but it can also fortify. When you spend time alone processing experiences, you develop internal dialogue. You build self-reflection. You learn to regulate your own emotions. You cultivate independence not as rebellion, but as necessity. That independence becomes a stabilizing force later in life. At the time, the hardship may have felt like chaos. It may have seemed disconnected from purpose. But hardship has a function. It exposes strengths that comfort never reveals. It reveals resilience that ease never tests. It stretches capacity beyond what you believed possible. Early adversity builds capacity. Capacity is the ability to carry more without collapsing. Emotional capacity, mental capacity, spiritual capacity. When challenges arrive early, they stretch your limits before you have time to define them narrowly. They teach you how to endure discomfort without immediate relief. They train you to adapt rather than panic. The version of you who endured those early hardships is not the same version who stands here now. That younger self faced circumstances that shaped their perception of strength. They learned lessons that did not require applause but demanded resilience. They discovered that stability could be built internally, even when it was unstable externally. Strength formed before recognition. This is crucial. Often people are recognized publicly only after they have developed privately. The world sees the polished result and assumes it appeared suddenly. But the strength required for visibility is formed long before it is seen. In your case, that formation began early. You learned how to carry weight without announcing it. You learned how to adapt without complaining. You learned how to endure without constant reassurance. That strength may have gone unnoticed by others at the time. It may have felt invisible. But invisibility does not equal insignificance. Strength that forms quietly is often the most stable. Training often begins before the assignment is revealed. You may not have known what you were being prepared for. You may not have understood why certain lessons repeated, why certain responsibilities returned, why certain patterns demanded your attention. But preparation does not require immediate explanation. Think about how skill is developed. Repetition precedes mastery. Resistance precedes growth. Discomfort precedes expansion. The same principle applies here. The challenges were not random interruptions. They were conditioning. Conditioning your resilience. Conditioning your discernment. Conditioning your internal authority. There is something about early hardship that clarifies perspective. When you encounter difficulty young, you are forced to confront reality directly. Illusions dissolve faster. Expectations adjust. You learn to read situations accurately. You become aware of complexity sooner. That awareness can feel heavy, but it also equips you. Equipping often feels like disruption. You may have looked at others and wondered why their path seemed lighter, why they were shielded from certain experiences, why their timeline appeared simpler. But simplicity does not always create depth. Ease does not always produce strength. Your path was different because your capacity was being shaped. Isolation that once felt painful now reveals independence. Responsibility that once felt unfair now reveals leadership. Challenges that once felt overwhelming now reveal resilience. When you look back with clarity, you see that nothing was wasted. You were being prepared long before you knew what you were being prepared for. The preparation was subtle. It was woven into everyday moments. It was present in the way you processed conflict, in the way you responded to disappointment, in the way you chose growth even when growth was uncomfortable. This realization reframes everything. The hardship was not evidence that you were unlucky. It was evidence that your foundation needed to be strong. The early tests were not punishments. They were calibrations. They measured your endurance. They stretched your awareness. They built your internal architecture. And internal architecture determines external stability. If recognition had arrived before capacity, it might have destabilized you. If opportunity had appeared before resilience formed, it might have overwhelmed you. Timing matters. Strength must precede exposure. Awareness must precede influence. You were not being delayed, you were being developed. When you understand that, resentment softens, comparison loses power, regret dissolves. You stop questioning why your path looked different. You begin appreciating that it was intentional. The early hardship did not break you, it built you. It did not remove your sensitivity, it refined it. It did not erase your intuition, it strengthened it. It did not eliminate your depth, it expanded it. And once you see that preparation was happening before you even recognized the assignment, your entire narrative shifts from victimhood to design. You were not randomly surviving, you were being shaped. You were designed, not discovered. If you step back and examine your life honestly, one thing becomes clear. The core of who you are has remained consistent across time. Trends changed, environments shifted, relationships came and went, seasons evolved. But certain traits never left you. Your traits are consistent across time. The awareness you carried as a child still exists now. It may be more refined, more disciplined, more controlled, but it is the same awareness. The depth that once made you feel different is still present. The intuition that guided you through early confusion still speaks. The internal voice that questions surface-level explanations still seeks meaning. That consistency matters, because if you were simply reacting to circumstances, your core identity would have fluctuated dramatically, but it did not. The same qualities reappeared in every stage of your life. When you were young and uncertain, when you were older and more confident, when you were isolated, when you were surrounded by people, the pattern held. Your intuition never left. There may have been moments when you ignored it, times when you doubted it, seasons when external noise drowned it out. But even then, it remained present. It warned you quietly, it nudged you gently, it redirected you when you drifted too far from alignment. Intuition is not something you learn in a single moment. It is something you recognize over time. The fact that it has remained active across years proves something important. It proves that it was not installed temporarily. It was built into you. Your awareness has always been active, even when you tried to fit in, even when you attempted to silence your depth, even when you questioned whether you were overthinking. Your perception continued operating. You noticed patterns, you sensed shifts, you detected inconsistency. That awareness did not disappear just because it was inconvenient. This is where the narrative changes. You were not randomly acquiring traits through life. You were expressing traits that were already part of your design. Identity precedes realization. Most people assume they become who they are through events, but in reality, events reveal who they are. The hardship did not create your resilience, it exposed it. The isolation did not create your independence, it activated it. The responsibility did not create your leadership, it highlighted it. Your identity existed before you consciously recognized it. That is why the signs were visible in childhood. That is why your traits remained consistent. That is why, even in seasons of doubt, you never fully lost yourself. You may have questioned your path, but you never truly questioned your core. Realization reveals design. When you begin to connect the dots, you see that nothing about you was accidental. The depth, the perception, the resilience, the independence, the internal authority. They were not assembled randomly through chaotic experiences. They were refined through them. Design does not mean perfection, it means intention. Your design included awareness because your path required discernment. Your design included resilience because your journey required endurance. Your design included independence because your calling required internal authority. When realization arrives, it does not create purpose, it uncovers it. You don't create purpose, you uncover it. This is one of the most powerful shifts in perspective. Many people spend years trying to manufacture a purpose. They search for something impressive enough to validate their existence. They experiment with identities. They chase roles. They try to build something that feels meaningful. But purpose is not constructed from scratch. It is discovered beneath layers of doubt. The reason your traits remained consistent is because they were connected to your design. The reason your intuition never left is because it was part of your framework. The reason your awareness persisted is because it was foundational. You were not evolving into something foreign. You were remembering something inherent. This changes how you see your entire story. Instead of viewing your life as a series of random developments, you begin to see it as a gradual unveiling, each stage revealing more of what was always present, each hardship clarifying your capacity, each season sharpening your awareness. The difference between design and discovery is subtle but profound. If you believe you were discovered, you assume someone else identified your value. If you believe you were designed, you understand that your value existed before recognition. Recognition does not create design, it acknowledges it. You were designed, not discovered. The world may notice you later. Others may eventually recognize what you carry. But recognition does not determine origin. Your awareness was active long before applause. Your resilience was strong long before validation. Your depth was real long before anyone affirmed it. And here is the most liberating truth of all. You were not an accident trying to find purpose. You were purpose learning its own name. The confusion you felt was not lack of direction. It was incomplete awareness. The searching you did was not proof that you were empty. It was part of the uncovering. The doubts you faced were not evidence that you were misplaced. They were obstacles that refined your clarity. You were not wandering without meaning. You were moving toward recognition of design, recognition of identity, recognition of the fact that you did not need to become chosen. You needed to understand that you already were. And once that realization settles in fully, your story no longer feels fragmented. It feels intentional. Now take a moment and let everything you've just heard settle into you. Your life was never random. Not the early awareness, not the isolation, not the responsibilities that arrived too soon, not the hardships that seemed unfair at the time. When you look at your story from a distance, you begin to see patterns instead of chaos. You begin to see progression instead of confusion. You begin to see design instead of accident. Randomness does not produce consistency, but your traits have been consistent. Your awareness has been steady. Your intuition has remained active. Your resilience has endured across seasons. That is not coincidence. That is structure. That is intention woven into your timeline. Your difference was never a flaw. It may have felt like one. It may have separated you. It may have made you question yourself. But what made you feel different is the very thing that made you perceptive. The depth that made conversations feel shallow at times is the same depth that allows you to see beneath the surface now. The sensitivity that once felt overwhelming is the same sensitivity that sharpens your discernment today. Difference is often misunderstood before it is recognized. You were not too much. You were aware. You were not out of place. You were ahead in perception. You were not overly serious. You were internally processing realities others ignored. What you once tried to hide is now the evidence of design. Your path was intentional, even when it felt unclear, even when it felt slower, even when it felt heavier than others. The early preparation, the repeated lessons, the quiet strengthening, none of it was wasted. Every season contributed something necessary. Every stage refined something foundational. Imagine this clearly: the chosen one looking back at their childhood self, not with regret, not with confusion, but with understanding. Seeing the young version of themselves who felt different, who carried weight quietly, who questioned why life seemed heavier at times, and finally realizing that nothing about that child was misplaced. That child was not struggling without meaning. That child was being shaped. That child was carrying awareness before it had language. That child was strong before it had proof. And now, as you stand here with clarity, you can see what they could not. You were never ordinary trying to become significant. You were significant learning to understand yourself. You were born chosen. You are simply remembering. Remembering the awareness that was always active. Remembering the resilience that was built early. Remembering the intuition that never truly left. Remembering that your difference was design, not defect. Remembering that your path was preparation, not punishment. The realization does not change your origin, it clarifies it. And when clarity replaces confusion, your entire narrative shifts. You no longer see yourself as someone who stumbled into purpose. You see yourself as someone who was always aligned with it, even before you consciously understood it. If this confirms something you've always felt but couldn't explain, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because your awakening has only just begun.